Market veteran Jim O'Neill, a former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, joins us with his sense of the markets right now, where there's been enough trouble in the currency market, so to speak. Jim, good to have you on the show, and thanks very much for taking out the time. How are you viewing what's happening with EM currencies, and especially the Indian rupee, which has fallen now 25% year to date?
Well, to be quite honest, I've been on holiday for much of the summer, so I've been trying to avoid looking at markets as I relax from my post-GSAM and Goldman life. But obviously, it's in my bones, so I still follow it all closely. I think the underlying issue here is obviously U.S. monetary policy and fears that the Fed is moving towards the beginning of withdrawing liquidity. And so whether it's the UK gilt market, where yields have risen quite significantly despite the fact the new Bank of England governor has led the bank into the promised land of so-called forward guidance, or your own challenges in India, the consequences of that are being felt all over the world. And I think one has to recognize, to some extent, there's not much any other country can do about it because of the importance of the US dollar and the US financial system, as we've seen repeatedly in my 30 or so years of looking at markets. That said, those countries with the weakest external fundamentals, particularly in the emerging world, are especially vulnerable. And I think what it highlights is what some people, myself included, have been saying for the past 2 years. India needs to do things to reduce its vulnerability, in particular, be much bolder and more ambitious and more determined about reform.
Last month you spoke about how India needs to, in a way, perhaps look at non-dollar deals at this point. We've just had the Commerce Ministry also indicate that currency swaps is an option. However, it's limited to the specific trade agreements that the country has with other countries. Do you think there can be respite in a meaningful manner that can come by and the rupees fall, or this is just like a global phenomenon and the rupee will find its level when it has to?
Well, I think primarily the latter. I mean, having looked at foreign exchange markets for over 30 years, about the only thing I can guarantee is that they go up and down. And any time any particular country tries to fight a global trend, it usually fails. There are many, many examples I could cite for you in both directions. And at the core of it is, as I've said, the importance of the US financial system and the dollar. Ultimately, over the very long term, the way for this kind of challenge to be resolved, and here India has a role to play as being one of the BRICS political countries, is to reduce the importance of the US financial system for the rest of the world. And that can only happen by having more and more major global products traded in things outside the US dollar, and with it, including finance. But in the meanwhile, whether it's India or Brazil's doing things, Indonesia's doing things, playing around with currency swap agreements can influence day-to-day activities, but it can't really influence the underlying trend. The specific thing that I believe India can focus on as a result of this is to think more carefully about the drivers of its current account deficit, which has been gradually increasing in recent years, and with it indirectly also its fiscal position and the overall macroeconomic policy framework. I think, as you know, Tanvir, and many of your listeners, a number of years ago I wrote a big paper called with a colleague on 10 things India needs to do to reach its potential. And I looked at it recently following a visit I made to India, and it hasn't really done any of those things. And India can't just assume it has a great future. It needs to have more determination and bold economic policy leadership.
Jim, just wondering if indeed the tapering that we are all speaking about is more pronounced than what the market may be factoring in right now, or happens prior to what the general belief would be. Can there be more pain for emerging market currencies and bonds?
Of course. I mean, I believe that in a normal world, if the US is recovering from its problems, then 10-year bond yields will eventually go to at least 4%, possibly somewhere between 4 and 5. And so any investment strategy around the world that has comparisons with the so-called risk-free rate as its base, there will be consequences for it, and that will probably mean further outflows at times from emerging markets. Having said that, it is also very important to note that in the past few days, U.S. data releases, particularly ones sensitive to interest rates, have been quite disappointing. And so while the Fed probably will so-called taper in September, I think the Fed will want to try to reassure not just investors but also households that they're going to try and stop interest rates rising too much. So it's not going to be a one-way street, and it might well be that there is some relief once we get the FOMC meeting in September out of the way.
Fair enough. Jim, for somebody who's tracked currencies for almost 30 years, or more than that, in fact, how are you viewing the current situation in India? Because there is view building about comparing the situation right now to the balance of payments crisis in 1991, while many believe that no, this is a unique situation and India needs to deal with it in its own way.
Well, I've got three thoughts about it, which to some extent are quite contradictory. The first of which, as I've touched on, India has got some unique challenges here related to the current account deficit, and with it, and taking me to the second point, if Indian coalition partners were to stop focusing so much on how to keep their role in the coalition with a view already to the next spring elections, and do more to stimulate genuine foreign investments and introduce reforms to allow major foreign investment into India, the crisis would disappear tomorrow. One of the other striking things about India compared to especially China, but also other large emerging economies, including some of the other BRICS, is how little FDI India has attracted the past few years. And it's because the Indian government doesn't encourage it. And there are so many sectors of the Indian economy where it is clearly necessary, and they should do it. And I think many investors would be very, very happy to participate, and that would solve the current account funding problem. And at some point, one would hope that would happen. The third thing I would say is that, I already joked about it, but I mean it, currencies never go in the same direction always, and at some point here, the Indian rupee is going to have extremely good value, and if it carries on like this, I'll be thinking about, at some point, perhaps having an investment in it myself, because it looks to me quite cheap.
What point would that be?
Well, because it's fallen so much. I will never forget the emerging market currency crisis of 1997, and then on the back of it, everything that happened in 98, and it became very fashionable to believe that many Asian currencies would fall forever. But in 1999, I remember recommending to people to invest in a basket of emerging market currencies in Asia, and people thought I was nuts, but it rallied significantly. And what happens is it gets to a point where, particularly in terms of foreign direct investments, countries become very attractive to major investors that are not so sensitive to short-term moves in the foreign exchange market, and see it as a very cheap opportunity to invest in a country they've been wanting to do for a while. And even though India has lots of challenges, it also has huge potential. And with the rupee having falling 25%, as you said at the start of the discussion, for a lot of foreign direct investors, that makes it 25% cheaper than it otherwise would have been.